One of the opening scenes of a very somewhat old movie called Grand Canyon. It's one of my favorite all-time movies. Many of you have maybe heard me refer to the movie over and over again. But as part of one of the opening scenes is there's this rather white, upper middle class lawyer leaving the Laker game, getting caught in traffic, driving in his BMW, and as he's stuck in the traffic, decides to take an exit and maybe try a different way, and ends up in a rather sketchy neighborhood. And if you know what happens, his car breaks down. He panics and calls for a tow service, but before the tow service arrives, there's a gang of young men who approach him, and one can feel the palpable fear as they approach, and one is actually carrying a gun and flashing it, and Mac is so aware of the disaster about to happen, and just right when that moment reaches a peak, a tow truck pulls up, and it's Simon, an African-American, older African-American gentleman who kind of breaks the tension and hooks the car up to the tow car, and the leader of this gang of young people challenges Simon and says, you can't leave. And Simon says, well, come with me. And they kind of go off to the side, and they have this conversation. Now, I do not know why this conversation is stuck with me, this little bit of dialogue, why it resonated with me. But I wanted to get it exactly, and I went back and watched this week because it's been 20 years since I've seen this movie, and it's still stuck with me. Simon tells this young man, he says, man, the world isn't supposed to work like this. I mean, maybe you don't know that. Maybe you don't know that yet. I'm supposed to be able to do my job without asking you if I can. That dude is supposed to be able to wait with his car without you ripping him off. Everything is supposed to be different than it is. This isn't the way the world is supposed to be. Over the years, I think that is probably the best definition of a broken world that I can imagine. Maybe even if I was using theology, the best definition of original sin, maybe, right? The world isn't supposed to be this way. It's supposed to be different. And those words echoed for me over the last week or so when an 18-year-old kid armed with an AR rifle walked into a high school and shot and killed 17 kids. And I remember thinking to myself, the world isn't supposed to be that way, is it? It's supposed to be different. In the midst of conversation and dialogue, and, well, if you can call it dialogue, debate, one of the ideas is to arm teachers. And I remember thinking to myself, the world isn't supposed to be that way. Someone teaching science or history or English to have to be armed in order to protect the kids. And I keep thinking to myself, those words resonate with me. The world is not supposed to be that way. The President of the United States calls immigrants rapists or snakes. The world's not supposed to be that way, is it? People cheered. That's not the way the world's supposed to be. We know that. There's this great chasm, this Grand Canyon that exists within our culture, our society, between us, in which there's no real connection, and we lob insults and angry words over that great chasm, and mostly on social media in so many different ways. And we know the world is not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be different. One of the things that always intrigued me about the story of Nicodemus is why he snuck to see Jesus at night. Here he is, he's a Pharisee, he's part of the Sanhedrin, he's part of the upper class, the power elite. He's got it made, right? He's in a position of power, he's assured of his own holiness in his own place in a society and in God's structure of the world. But what was it that attracted him? What was it that intrigued him about Jesus? That he sought him. Now, he went at night. Obviously, the idea that John's trying to express is that he had to go at night because he didn't want everybody else to know he was there. And he says, he sees Jesus and he says to him, well, you know, the things you do, the things you say, I got to believe that's got to be from God. And I often wonder if, in some ways, Nicodemus, in many ways, is open to this truth that the world isn't quite what he expected. That it isn't what it's supposed to be. He can look around him and see the pain of the world, the injustice that exists, the anger and hatred that existed. And I often wondered if what drove him to Jesus, what drove him to encounter Jesus, was this sense of the brokenness of the world. That it isn't what it's supposed to be, and that he believed Jesus had a message, had a perspective that pointed to an answer to that question. And Jesus says, if you want to be born of the Spirit, you must be born from above. Now, the Greek word here has all kinds of connotations. Born from above, born again, born anew, this sense of spiritual rebirth. A phrase common in the South, are you born again? Often referring to some kind of action in which you turn your life over to Jesus and you've earned your way into heaven by being born again. And Nicodemus, he seems to be kind of, either he's a literalist or he's kind of seemingly being obstinate. He says, well, how can I enter my mother's womb and be born again? Now, most scholars point out that's a very common rabbinic argument, is to kind of, by stressing how something's impossible, invites the speaker to, in many ways, expand on what the teacher is saying. So he may be being obstinate, he may be being a literalist, but he's probably more inviting Jesus. What do you mean by that? To be born anew, to be born from above, to be born again. And Jesus says, well, it's like the wind. You don't know where it comes from, and you don't know where it's going to go, but you know it's there. So it is with people born of the Spirit. And Jesus asked him, well, how can you being a teacher of Israel, not know about spiritual revival, not know about a new sense of God's presence? How can you not know that's what's needed? And so Jesus explains what that revival is. He says, for God so loved the world, God gave the Son so that the world might be saved. God did not send the Son to condemn the world, but to make it whole. And so I think part of what attracts Nicodemus in his faith tradition of so many laws and so many ways in which they try to put boundaries around God's love, he caught a glimpse that what Jesus was saying is that the reality, he says, if you want to see the kingdom, the reality is you have to see a love that is boundaryless. You have to understand that it's about that reality, the world, the way it really is a God who loves the whole world enough to give an incarnation into it. Jesus' message is a radical assertion that the basis of the world is not selfishness and hate. It's not, the basis of the world is not the injustices we see around us. Jesus' assertion was that God so loved the world, all of it, everyone in it, black, white, whatever the color of their skin, whatever their political persuasion, whoever they are, God so loved the world, God gave the Son, so that everyone could have life. Now, there's a part of this I don't like. I'll have to be honest. God sent the Son not to condemn the world, but to make it whole. And I don't like that, folks. I want God condemning the injustices all around us. I'll be honest. I want God condemning those people I disagree with, those people I'm angry with, those racists or those people who hold ideas I find abhorrent. I want God condemning them, you know? But God sent the Son not to condemn the world, but to save it. I find that incredibly challenging. Now, among my clergy friends and among non-clergy friends, there's this interesting dialogue going on, particularly around the shooting in Florida, in which people are kind of taking to task what people often say, which is, I'm sending you my thoughts and prayers. And I totally get that and totally understand that in a sense, in many ways, that's an excuse not to do something, not to make some change, not to either whatever one wants to articulate, that just sending thoughts and prayers is just an excuse to not do something different. And I get that. But I also think that there's something about the transformation of our thoughts and prayers that leads to a transformation of our hearts. I also think it isn't simply about doing something. It's about a willingness to deepen our faith and to realize the boundarylessness of God's love and to have our hearts changed. Our rather egocentric, selfish little hearts that want to mete out God's love to only the deserving, right? That really what Jesus is preaching is, in many ways, a spiritual rebirth, a turning around of our hearts away from a world that's not the way it's supposed to be to a world in which a boundaryless love transforms it all. And one might think that's an impossibility. The question is, when we gather for prayer, when we gather here on Sunday morning, we do get our batteries recharged. We do get a sense of feeling God's love and grace and celebrating that. But it's also a sense in which we ought to be willing to be reborn, to have our own hearts and spirits transformed, right? That moves away from the selfishness and egoism, which, interesting enough, this idea of being born again in much of our tradition was more about our selfish soul than it was about a heart transformed which loves the world. That when we gather here on Sunday morning, there should be a spiritual rebirth in our hearts and minds, in which God's love is much bigger than we can ever imagine. And that's what Jesus was preaching to Nicodemus. Not that you don't confront the brokenness of the world, but your task is to believe that that changed heart, that the world is moving to a point in which love can transform it. And I don't know that we really, truly believe that. We get so caught up in how the world's not the way we think it should be. It's interesting, Jesus tells Nicodemus, he says, if you want to see the kingdom, not just enter it, if you really want to see God's reality of love, boundaryless love, you have to look. And it blows from places you don't expect to see it, and it blows you to places where you don't expect to see it at all. One of the things theologians point out about this passage is that it says, God sent the Son into the world, that God gave and God sent. And this idea of God is always about God sending from the beginning of creation. It's always about God reaching out, no matter how many times people rejected it. It's always about, from the beginning of creation, God wandering through the Garden of Eden saying, "Where are you, Adam?" Is that not a metaphor for how God has operated through creation? From the beginning, God always sending prophets and people to proclaim this boundaryless love, a love without limits. And always people turned away, but God continues to send. And the radical truth of that is that we, who are people of the Spirit, with transformed hearts, bigger hearts, boundaryless hearts, are the ones who are supposed to be sent as well. Theologians call this the missional God. God is always on a mission to shatter the boundaries of God's love. God's always sending, and the people God is sending to do that is you and me. That to be the church is to be the people sent. So we gather here on Sunday morning. We have our hearts filled, our hearts reborn, but we're called to leave this building and go out in the world and say, this is the way the world's supposed to be. Right? And you may be sent to a neighbor who's in pain. You may be sent to a child who's afraid. You may be sent to serve at the homeless shelter. You may be sent to go to the Capitol and advocate for something. But know this, you are sent for a reason. The only question is, can you proclaim the world and live in a world the way it's supposed to be? To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.